Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Adam Smith Institute's weekly webinar. Tonight, we will be reevaluating international relations with China. As ground zero for the coronavirus pandemic, there are many questions left unanswered as to the virus's origin and China's level of responsibility and the damage it has caused. All of this is taking place in the context of a trade war with with the United States, allegations of human rights abuses of Uyghur Muslims, and brutal police crackdowns of protests in Hong Kong. China also appears to be keen to exploit a perceived international leadership vacuum presented by the Trump administration. There seems to be a huge contrast between the West having a sort of dark night of the soul and China's desire to reshape the world order. What exactly are China's ambitions, and how does it plan to realize them? To answer these questions, we are joined by Juliet Samuel, who is a columnist at the Daily Telegraph and fellow at Policy Exchange. She has written extensively on China's handling of the pandemic and how the West must take on China to defend free trade. We're also joined by Latika Burke of the Sydney Morning Herald, who has covered Australia's relationship with China, covering the West's supply chain's dependence on China and the need to diversify. She'll also be joined shortly by Dr. Jonathan Ward, who I think is having some technical difficulties. He works for the Center for a New American Security and has recently authored China's Vision of Victory, an in-depth analysis of China's grand strategy and what it means for the world. And we'll be discussing how the US can respond to the CCP's expansionist agenda. So if I could start with you, Latika, because you've been covering the recent World Health Assembly over the last 2 days. China co-sponsored a motion calling for an independent review into the handling of the pandemic, but Australia called for an international inquiry, if I understand correctly, before that, and was met with trade strikes and hostile rhetoric. Do you think we've seen a U-turn in China's approach, or do you think it's just been a successful renegotiation on China's part, or is it that China's taken a de facto control of the inquiry as a whole? Sorry, Latika, can you hear me? Hello? Oh, dear. Can anyone else hear me?
I can hear you, John.
I can hear you.
Oh, crikey. Oh, dear. Right. How are we going to sort this out? If Juliet could kick us off then, if you could talk to us about China's early handling of the pandemic and how you think.
I've got some other, a bit of stuff to say about UK policy, but I can cover a bit of that.
Yes, please. No, please do. Please do.
Yeah. So, in terms of generally, I think that the pandemic has caused the UK to wake up to China and to the nature of the Chinese Communist Party. And the reason that that has happened is that China presided over this pandemic. We obviously don't know exactly where it originated, but we do know that in the first month or perhaps 2 months of its handling, what happened was a concerted and serious, successful effort at cover-up, at least for the first month, which involved basically persecuting whistleblowers, trying to clamp down on so-called rumors in order to suppress the medical community from sharing information about what was happening, which also lost valuable weeks in the containment of the virus. And we know that this wasn't just happening on a local level among the Wuhan authorities, as China would like us to now believe, but that this was a systemic issue that went right up the chain. And we know that because of things like leaks to the South China Morning Post in, I think it was late December, recounting unpublished government documents that essentially had numbers for the outbreak that were not being admitted to. And we also know this because people who watch these things very carefully, for example, people in biotechnology in Singapore, could see, because they were monitoring online social media in China, that there was something happening. and they knew that there was human-to-human transmission happening and we know that they knew that because they started preparing, ramping up the Singaporean government's preparations for an epidemic and stockpiling and getting machines ready. So we know that this was knowable to the Chinese authorities because it was knowable to people sitting on their computers in Singapore watching Chinese social media, even as it was censored. So we know they covered that up. And probably since about January the 20th, which was when they admitted that human-to-human transmission of this virus could happen, I think there was a shift in the handling of the virus, whereby I think probably, at least the consensus among scientists seems to be that the data from China became more reliable from that point onwards. I mean, there's still mass censorship within China about sharing, there's certainly no free flow of information, but the data that is being flowing out into the world, I think, is probably more reliable. And the notion that they have contained their epidemic, I think, is probably also reliable, which we know not just from numbers, but from probably more importantly in a Chinese context, things like major political meetings being convened that had been delayed, which probably would not be happening if they thought there was a huge risk of, major Communist Party members getting the virus. So that, in a positive summary, is I think what China has been doing. I mean, I should say that even though the data has improved, there is still mass censorship of information, coming out of laboratories in China. There's been an explicit order that any scientific research to do with the virus has to be sent to political authorities before it can be submitted to journals for publication. So we are getting some great science out of China on the virus, and Chinese scientists are really, putting all their skills to use and really trying, but they're contending with a political system that is determined to muzzle and filter all of their work in order to avoid it contradicting anything that the Chinese Communist Party wants to be said. So I would say it's about time that Britain has woken up to the nature of the regime that we're dealing with. And if we look back at China policy in the UK over the last 10 to 20 years, I'd summarize it as, for a long time, we thought that China was a nasty, despotic place, but they made cheap stuff and we didn't have to worry. We just bought it and, occasionally said, isn't it bad about their human rights? And then shortly after Xi Jinping came to power and the Tories came to power over here in 2010, we had a shift after the Dalai Lama meeting, and we suddenly decided that actually China, God, they've gotten a lot richer, haven't they? So, I suppose that they're going to become just like us, and actually they're a huge cash cow, and they're going to make us rich. And we shouldn't look too closely at all those human rights things we used to worry about. And so what COVID has done has shifted us into the scales have fallen for our eyes, and we've woken up and realized that China is both a place that is in absolute terms richer than us and has a horrible totalitarian regime that does not wish us, does not have benign wishes for us, and in fact views us as a juicy target, as a very successfully penetrated target for technology, for propaganda, for political persuasion or cajoling. And that we have essentially been chumps, and we are now finally realizing that. So I'm just going to very quickly go through a few areas in which we need to sort this, address this issue. And the first one is supply chains, that we have realized that we are chronically dependent on China for some pretty essential kits, and that actually we don't want to necessarily be building Huawei technology or Chinese state nuclear power company kit into our critical infrastructure, and we'd rather have some suppliers from allied companies. So we clearly need to set up or beef up our investment screening processes, and take into account. And one of the problems we've got is the notion of civil military fusion, which is a huge tenet of Chinese Communist Party policy, which is that essentially there is no line between the civil and the military spheres in China. So the distinction that we like to draw is, well, is this a security matter or is this just, for consumer tech or whatever? That distinction simply doesn't exist in China. So if you are dealing with a Chinese company, then you are by extension dealing with the Chinese Communist Party, because all Chinese companies have to do what the Chinese Communist Party wants, whether they want to or not. And so we need to change our screening to take account of that issue. And we also need to use, our huge government procurement budget to encourage supply chain growth of companies that we need and supply the stuff that we want. And then we also, related to that, need to completely overhaul our science funding and our science policy, because for a really long time, the UK simply hasn't funded the technologies that we need to make the stuff that we need. So if you speak to scientists in telecoms technologies, for example, and applied physics, they will tell you that it was simply impossible to get funding for the stuff that we need 10 years ago. And so, they had to scrabble around for ways to make their research look sexy. And then suddenly, Huawei shows up in the UK probably from about 2015 onwards and starts throwing around unbelievable amounts of cash, simply essentially buys up access to a huge amount of valuable UK tech. And while we were asleep at the wheel. And so that brings me to the second area, which is the academic sphere, which is one of the most thoroughly penetrated parts of UK society. I mean, we've got a huge number of Chinese students here, and that is a good thing in many ways, because it's great to have cross-pollination of ideas and people. But that isn't actually what happens, because Chinese students often come here and they're forced to live within the building, with all the other Chinese students. They're monitored constantly by the Chinese Communist Party. There's no help for them on campus if they're worried about free speech, or if they're worried about, even being able to say things in class. And professors have said to me that they can see their Chinese students nervous about commenting in classes, particularly if there are other Chinese students there, because they know that they are being monitored. So we've got issues like that. We've got issues of our campuses succumbing to censorship, just Chinese students protesting things like the way Taiwan is referred to, and then sort of hapless academics or perhaps more corrupt university administrators kowtowing to that. And then we've got the research side of things, which is, our academics collaborating, on projects with Chinese scientists, many of whom have military links or security links or links to the surveillance state of China. And, our academics, I think some of it, maybe there's a willful blindness there where they're just they don't want to look into it too closely. They want to work with the best guy in the field or best woman in the field, and they don't care who they're from. But there's also, the government needs to help them, because it's actually very difficult for a British academic to know if the partner that they've found in China has some kind of deeply suspect link to a company or a military conglomerate that they don't know about. And then the other major area is in politics and finance. A huge chunk of Britain's elite, have ended up with board positions and some quite nice connections and flights and consultancies, and that goes right to the top of UK society. Right up to David Cameron, who has a major role with an investment fund that promoting One Belt, One Road. So there needs, and that partly I think is a job for the media to shine the light on this and to start asking people, well, why are you sitting on the board of that state company in China? Why do you think that's a good idea? Do you have full freedom of speech when you do those sorts of things? Who are your connections, etc.? And people need to realize that this isn't just something that is totally innocent anymore. Unfortunately, because of the regime we're dealing with, we have to start asking people questions and applying some scrutiny to what is going on, because we've been taken for a ride, essentially. And I do think that once we start this process of going through our society line by line, we're going to see just how penetrated we have been by CCP propaganda and just efforts to get at our technology and some of the best stuff that we have to offer. And I think we're going to have a fight on our hands. But that fight is what will make the problem visible. And if we can't see it, we can't fix it. So that's what I think the UK needs to do in a nutshell, is protect our own, protect what we've got first, and then we can think about how we project globally.
So do you think we're too far gone along with the Huawei 5G thing? Like, do you think we should cancel it?
We should accept that there may be a year's delay, maybe it will be 18 months delay, and it's going to be expensive, but it's going to be less expensive to address that issue now than it is in another 5 years when we've built even more Huawei kit into our network. So I think we should bite the bullet now and rip it out.
Do we have alternatives? I mean, we don't seem to have any of our own 5G infrastructure that we can develop.
Ericsson and Nokia, I mean, there are rivals to Huawei. They're just a bit further behind and they're a bit more expensive, but they exist. You know, this idea that there's no alternative is absolute nonsense. And I mean, you can see that because other countries like France or the Czech Republic or the US are going to, are using alternatives.
So I think it's quite interesting that in the media there's been comparatively little focus on the Chinese early obfuscation of data coming out related to coronavirus, and much more focus on sort of failures of the West, particularly in the UK and the United States. I was wondering why do we think that's the case? I mean, we seem to really be quite content to sort of pull the veil over our own eyes when it comes to calling out China.
I think, I think part of it is that we've handled the pandemic very badly. So there's some justified self-criticism there. Mm-hmm. And part of that is our own blindness and just failure to run things well. And part of that is, the Eastern Hemisphere has been through several of these potential pandemics, and they have the benefit of experience and we don't. So, that's just how things are. But I think there's also maybe particularly in science, it's a discipline brought up on the idea of self-criticism. And they're more comfortable criticizing a system that they know rather than one that they don't know, but just seems to be a kind of powerhouse producing all this stuff. And so I think there's a degree to which we're too navel gazing and maybe too ignorant, and we lack confidence to challenge what's going on.
Fair enough. So if I could move on to you, Latika, we've seen from the World Health Assembly over the last couple of days that China seems to have done a miraculous U-turn on a free and independent inquiry into the handling of coronavirus. I feel like there's a lot more to the story there. So if you could maybe run through us what you think might be the sort of the CCP's agenda in that regard.
Hi, John. Thanks for having me, and sorry for the technical difficulties earlier.
All
so
right.
Australia was calling for an inquiry into the pandemic. I think it was the first country to call for it. One criticism I'd probably have of the Australian government's approach was that it was a very ill-defined kind of inquiry. Was it an inquiry into the World Health Organization? Was it an inquiry into China? Was it an inquiry into whether this is from a lab or whether it's from a wet market, which, by the way, the latter is the Australian government's view. And so Australia's been working towards this inquiry kind of loosely. Now, that's gathered a lot of public support. Where we saw in the end it was actually the EU, the passive EU when it comes to China policy, drafting this resolution. Now, in the end, a pretty decent coalition of countries got behind it, including at the very last stage, China. But I do just want to read you this one quote from the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman. And he said to an Australian journalist in a press conference only in the last few hours, The context of the text, this is the text of the resolution, is totally different from the independent review that you talked about, you meaning an Australian reporter representing the Australian government's view that was put to the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman. So I think from that we can see pretty clearly that the Chinese think that this is a review that they can get in on, they can control, and they can have some power over. And I think that that was probably always inevitable. The US was absent, and this is obviously, I think, one of the key things. You cannot talk about China and the West without mentioning the US's own role and its own demise and its own disarray and its own incapability to lead anywhere on this. If you look at Huawei, for example, the UK made the Huawei decision despite intense US lobbying, in fact, in almost defiance of President Trump's wishes. And you do start to wonder how much different British policy might be, how much more security aligned it might be if it weren't a President Trump that a Prime Minister Boris Johnson was seen to be following or not, or in his case is doing a lot to make sure he's seen to be not following Donald Trump. So the inquiry has been welcomed in Australia overnight. The Foreign Minister, Marise Payne, has put out a very warm statement saying that this will look at the transmission of the virus from animals to humans. It will look at the source. Now, notably in the resolution, there's no mention of wet markets or the lab. And there's actually no even mention of China in it, but it doesn't need to be. We all know, the world all knows where this came from. And it was kind of funny hearing Juliet recapping the chart and the timeline, because it's almost drifted from consciousness, hasn't it? It's almost fallen out of the way we talk about this pandemic in only the last few weeks. And it's sometimes difficult to remember that this pandemic only began a few months ago.
So with regards to international pressure on China, I get the sense that most of us probably feel there needs to be a more cohesive approach from the UK, from Australia, from the States. Why do we think that hasn't really formed yet? Do we think it might be able to come together quite quickly in the next few years or so?
No, I think it's important to keep in mind that within the Five Eyes, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, UK, US, those relationships with the US do run very deeply. They go beyond the president. So once President Trump is removed from office or is no longer the president, I do think some of these things will no longer mean that they are the critical issues in the media that they could be. And it's more of a case in Britain that that's an issue. In Australia, for example, Scott Morrison doesn't really get asked to explain or defend or answer for something that President Donald Trump has done in the United States. Yeah. It's a bit of a different conversation. But I would say in Australia, the conversation on China, a lot of people like to say Australia's following the United States. I wouldn't say it's quite like that. In fact, we've just had a big row with the United States over this constant pushing of this idea that the virus came from a lab. Now, it may well have come from a lab, but the United States is running around saying they have all this evidence without showing any of it. And that was actually seen in Australia to be undermining Australia's call for an inquiry, which will hopefully discover the true source of this virus, whether it was from a lab or from a wet market. So it's not always the case that Australia is following the US. And in fact, in Australia, we've done some pretty huge things that come at a lot of economic pain. I mean, the same day that this resolution was introduced into the World Health Assembly, China announced an 80% tariff on barley imports from Australia. So I think you can see that this is coming to Australia, which is far more economically dependent on China than Britain at the moment, at enormous cost. So I think it's a very gutsy stand from Australia. We've introduced very strong laws against foreign interference. We have just released a university holistic approach looking at how to combat foreign interference on campuses. We have, over the years, as we have learned our own lessons from foreign investment, we've tightened up foreign investment rules, and they're actually getting stricter by the minute, really. So I think one of the great lessons to come out of this, as Juliet was saying, is supply chain resilience. Security and supply lines are going to go hand in hand for the next decade or two. And what we might have thought were simply public goods or things that could be bought on the free market easily and readily, I think going forward, we're going to see a security shroud around lots of goods we previously would not have thought in that way.
do you think we'll all end up worse off if we're all having to pull back from relying on China so heavily for our supply chains? Do you think it's necessarily a trade-off between protecting our interests and taking an economic hit from China? Is there no way we can kind of balance these interests out?
Well, I mean, I think 2020 is a pretty bad year for everyone, isn't it? We've plunged our developed economies into a developing economy that lied to us and continue to expose the world to zoonotic viruses. One way or another, China let this virus out and then tried to play the grand kind of benevolent, uncle, farming out PPE wherever it sought appropriate. So I think we've all got some lessons to learn. And if the answer is we need to rely so heavily on China that we don't have any independence when it comes to looking after our own security or our public health, the question is completely wrong.
Fair enough. So, Jonathan, if I could bring you in now, Zika's made a lot of comments about the United States' approach to handling the pandemic in China. If you've got anything to say about that, I'd very much appreciate it.
I think leaving aside the pandemic, because honestly, that's not my area. I mean, my background's in Chinese grand strategy, U.S.-China relations, China-India relations. I mean, the pandemic, I think, has done an important thing here, which is to accelerate the world's wake-up call to China. And the difference in I think when you think about this globally, the United States has been on a track, at least in Washington, to wake up to the problem of China for the last 2 or 3 years. So there's sort of a bipartisan consensus around this. The national security strategy was rewritten with China as essentially the primary adversary. I mean, national defense strategy, pretty much all the strategic documents that matter in the last couple of years are about a reprioritization of global issues, realizing that China is the central challenger. As a specialist in Chinese Communist Party grand strategy, working with many primary documents and all of that. And that's what my book, China's Vision of Victory, does, is it brings all those documents together for people to read them themselves. China has a long-term program of becoming the dominant power in the world. So most of what, when for instance, Juliet talking about Britain being sort of successfully penetrated for economic and espionage and other purposes, I mean, this is really happening all over the world. They've saturated most of the planet with influence operations and generally following on economic interests. So the strategy that the Communist Party is undertaking is to essentially turn economic power into military power, to build a military that will guard their overseas interests, and ultimately to create a world which Xi Jinping calls the community of common destiny for mankind. And that's this idea of a world in which China has once again become the central polity among all other states. And in doing so, they're in direct conflict with the United States and with the world order that was sort of built in the 20th century by successful victories by democracies over, authoritarianism, and whether the Second World War or the Cold War. I mean, all of these were a democratic coalition at the end of the day, taking out authoritarian rivals for ultimate power. So China seeks to sort of replay this game with the West, to build the world in its own image. They call it the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. It's the idea that they'll become the dominant power by the year 2049, which is symbolic. And you add to the global health pandemic, the global economic crisis that we're in. And normally the 2020s would have been a decade where many economists see China surpassing the United States towards the end of the decade. Today, there's the question of, could they do that sooner if they're able to come out of this economic crisis more quickly and pull supply chains closer and become and play economic coercion with places like Australia and elsewhere. I mean, are they going to be able to shift a center of gravity towards themselves sooner than they otherwise would through natural sort of macroeconomic forces? So bottom line, I mean, the US has been waking up to this for a long time. It's great to see Britain waking up to this. I think that took much longer, and I say that as someone who did a doctorate on China-India relations in the UK at Oxford. So, clearly it was not top of mind in security circles in the UK for a long time. So, bottom line, I mean, supply chains are going to be a big piece of this. I mean, you're really going to have to move the supply chains out of China and move them into the allied democracies. I mean, if you think about the world's democracies as 2/3 of global GDP, I mean, the United States is 25%, but you start adding up the alliance system from, Britain to Japan to Australia. I mean, ultimately, we're about 65, even 70% of the global economy. China's about 15%. So there's no good reason for us to be dependent on China in the long run. China's really played its cards very well. and with the support of many multinationals, investment banks, all the rest of it, and really everybody looking for pure economic advantage, and treating China simply as a destination where you could offshore factories, do all the rest of it, without knowing anything about the security problems. I mean, this all has to be redone, rethought, redesigned. You're going to need government working much more closely with industry in order to build secure supply chains. And ultimately, I think that where we're really headed is towards economic containment of China. And this is really an old idea from the early Cold War, where ultimately we won the Cold War because there were two economic blocs. Because at the end of the day, the Soviet Union was never in any way, shape, or form an economic rival. And that led to, over time, eventually, the erosion of their power. So today, I mean, China's entire play is to become that economic center and therefore to coerce global politics towards their end as they move up in capabilities militarily to defend the general great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. So it's a very sophisticated strategy, but we have to start cutting it off. We're going to have to start cutting off capital and technology, particularly into civil military fusion, related enterprises, and into their human rights suppression apparatus. I mean, you start to do those two things, and you're going to put up serious economic barriers to China. You will sort of reduce the problem of China becoming the economic center of gravity that can coerce other nations. And ultimately, you'll have the opportunity to reintegrate the free world in an enormous trading community that's unencumbered by these predatory practices. So for those that like free trade, and I think that's become far more of an ideology than a reality at this point. Free trade has been massively distorted by a 12 trillion, $14 trillion mercantilist nation that essentially has imperial ambitions with its economic practices. So we're going to have to rework the global system so that, rule of law, free trade, innovation, all of these goods that sort of democratic nations and rights-based nations care about can exist, without the participation, without the reliance or dependency on a place like China. That's really going to be the most important general strategy of this decade. How to do it is going to be the big hard part, but what to do is much simpler.
So, what if China were to succeed in this agenda? What would the world order look like? Would we be in a sort of state of vassalage with China? I mean, what would change?
I think of it this way: everything that Juliet described, which I thought was a very strong assessment of how things look in Britain. I mean, the sort of elite capture, the ability to do economic coercion, to do espionage. This is China of 2020. China's leaders don't care about 2020. They care about the year 2049. So give them another 30 years. Okay, you're talking about a society. I mean, this is a shadow of the China that the Communist Party would like China to be. This is a China whose military is inferior to the United States, whose economy is smaller than the United States, whose technology has not yet caught up to the OECD nations. Now, you imagine them succeeding at some of their core strategies. The Belt and Road, for example, I mean, people think of it as just it's an infrastructure project, but it exists on these time frames for a Communist Party strategy. It's meant to culminate in 2049. And at that point, you'd essentially have the entire Eurasian sort of supercontinental structure with the Indian Ocean and Australia sort of all added into everything ex-North America would become economically tied to China in a way that today is just a small fraction of that. Imagine that 30 years into the future. Imagine a China whose economy was far larger than any other power on earth, whose military was far stronger. I mean, we're already talking about the end of the military balance in the Pacific. I mean, the U.S. is going to have a much tougher time with China in terms of deterrence and all the rest of it right now. And they're still, they're not even close to where they want to be. So I mean, what would Britain's life be like under the community of common destiny? I would leave that to your imaginations. I think today,
where it belongs, hopefully.
Think of 10x where you are today. And yes, and then you take the realities of China internally. I mean, you take Xinjiang, you take Hong Kong. All of these things are happening in a world where China is not the dominant power. Change that piece and ask yourself, what protection do you really have? None.
So I feel like one bit we may have missed out on is there seems to be a kind of a dark night of the soul for the West. If I'm being cynical for a minute, we feel decadent. It feels as if Western civilization is on decline. We've lost faith in our own ideals. And China, by contrast, seems to feel none of this. They seem to feel increasingly nationalistic and belligerent in some cases. Do you think we need to see a sort of a reconnection with Western liberal democratic values if we're going to take this challenge seriously?
Two things. I mean, one, China's sense of destiny is largely manufactured by the Communist Party at this point. And it's a fun and useful debate for China specialists like myself. I mean, what came first, China's nationalism or the Communist Party of China? Which one? You know, they're two sides of the same coin. I mean, the Communist Party inherited, as they see it, from Sun Yat-sen, but the nationalism that we're seeing in China is not new, and it's not Xi Jinping. I mean, when I was over there as a 22-year-old studying at Beijing University and backpacking all around, you know, Xinjiang and Tibet and seeing the whole country, I mean, I was meeting young people my age telling me they wanted to nuke the United States off the face of the earth. All right, who was Xi Jinping in 2006 or 7? Nobody knows him. This is a Communist Party, anti-Western, anti-American nationalism that's, you know, mostly been pumped through their schools since Tiananmen Square. So there's some really ugly stuff that goes on there. I think we should all have a better understanding of that. But, you know, it is essentially exacerbated by the party and its approach to the world. Now, as for the West and the dark night of the soul, I mean, bottom line, I mean, this is going to be a moment for us to come together. I mean, we're going to have to realize that, I mean, the Western alliance, I mean, the US, European, you know, sort of relationship, which I think, if anything, has been under duress since September 11th. I'm not sure we were all on the same page after that. So I think we've really had quite a long time before, you know, since America and Europe have been as close as we could be. But we're going to have to come together on this. I mean, we have to have a shared vision between America, Europe, allied Asia Pacific, I mean, like Japan, Australia, you know, Korea. Then you bring India into this. I mean, you're talking about some incredibly important and exciting countries that, when we start to work together, and you see these free world sort of liberal democratic values that really matter all over the planet. I mean, that's what we want to be working from, but a bedrock has to be the Western alliance. So we're going to have to find a new US European dialogue that makes us closer and not farther apart.
So I'd like to open things up to the Q&A session now and to the rest of the panel as well. The first thing I would like to ask is with regards to the Belt and Road Initiative. Do we think that it's possible the recession, the global recession we're going into, will play into China's advantage, in that many of the places where Belt and Road Initiatives are taking place will now struggle to meet their debt repayment schedules, and China will start to ask for collateral in the form of companies, in the form of national infrastructure?
It's possible, but it will make the project very, very expensive. And I think there's a question over the sustainability of all that outward investment anyway, when it's not being directed on commercial terms, but on the basis of some, you know, megalomaniacal vision of the Chinese Communist Party. And I think, you know, what we're going to see, there's a question, the question behind One Belt, One Road is really a question about the Chinese economy. Are they going to be able to afford to keep up that sort of quasi imperialist commercial project? And I don't think they are. It just seems too expensive to me. But yes, there will probably be some pieces along the way that kind of come into their hands because through debt defaults, etc. But I don't think that the whole thing is just going to continue unabated.
I would add to that, John, one of the notable things about Xi Jinping's speech to the World Health Assembly was that he specifically singled out Africa, which I think is a sensitivity about China's operations there and how much it knows it will suffer if the disease really runs its ravages over Africa, and then leaves governments incapable of paying back some of those debts. And he actually announced a debt extension, plus, of course, $2 billion for the developing world. And I think we can read into that pretty much Africa as well. So I think China is not as approaching this from the position of strength we might think it either.
I'd like to add to that. I mean, when you think about the how the Belt and Road works. I mean, it's really the question at the end of the day is can they afford it? I mean, how does the financing work? And the problem you've got is at present, I mean, there are places that are advocating for the Belt and Road in their own marketing materials that, you know, like HSBC, Standard Chartered, I mean, British banks, you know, some American banks here and there, but it's become a global project de facto. I mean, Britain's, I believe it was the Chancellor of the Exchequer at the first Belt and Road Summit went out and said, we will make Xi Jinping's vision a reality. I mean, this is the biggest problem, by the way, in the US-UK relationship. I know that Britain has its feelings towards the current administration, but at the end of the day, we will not have a special relationship until we see eye to eye on China. If London becomes a funding mechanism for China's strategic ambitions, if, you know, the UK becomes a technology harvesting ground for civil military fusion, we're not going to have a relationship in this century, anything like the one we had in the past. So we all need to be very serious about this. Australia and the US are very close on this. India and the US are close on this. Japan and the US are very close on this. Britain and America need to come together on this, because at the end of the day, the Belt and Road is basically a financing project. I mean, it pours money into Chinese strategic initiatives that ultimately do have military properties. I mean, you look at the military exercises that, for instance, in the Arabian Sea that were designed to protect Gwadar as a strategic hub of the Belt and Road. I mean, these are the words of Chinese military officers. So when HSBC or when Standard Chartered are you know, advertising to their clients, hey, we can get you into the Belt and Road. You're bringing Western capital into these strategic initiatives. The US has already got this picture, but London needs to understand it too. Because China can't fund it on their own. That's absolutely true. I mean, China can't do the next level of growth without Western capital, without American capital, British capital, etc. That's how the next phase works. We got to prevent that phase.
So we need a sort of an alliance to, as you say, contain the economic development of China.
Here, let's put it this way. Don't think of it as economic development. I mean, that's not what this is. You're talking about a country whose you know, gross GDP is larger than anything on the planet other than the United States. You know, who's converting all of this into military equipment, and also their leaders are very busy saying we're preparing to fight and win wars. So they mean to use this stuff. They fought wars with every single neighbor they had in the 20th century. You know, their military is a lot better now than it was in the Korean War, in the China-India border war, you know, in the conflicts with the USSR. They mean to use this stuff, and it will be funded by us and built on our technology if it ever happens. And at that point, we're going to be in a crisis far different from COVID-19, and much more consequential. So, you know, now is the time for us to get the picture, to start to understand what's really happening here, and to understand that as allies and not simply in a bilateral sort of American wake-up way that isn't yet catching on. And yes, we have to cut our funding to China's civil military fusion initiatives, which is basically everything. As Juliet said, there's really no distinction in China between the civilian industries and the military industries. That's how it's designed. And cut funding to, you know, to the surveillance state and human rights apparatuses. I mean, when you think about the South China Sea Islands, I mean, those weren't built by Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang down there, you know, putting sand on you know, reefs. I mean, this was China Communications Construction Corporation. I mean, these companies are known to the world, and they advertise to the world, and they do business with the world. When you think about the concentration camps in Xinjiang, there's cement companies, glass companies, banks. I mean, all of this, we're participating. We are part of this now.
And I just add to that, John, to give a tangible kind of practical example of Belt and Road and how, to go to Jonathan's point about China meaning to use these assets. So in Australia's patch, for example, we had the Chinese, they built all over the South Pacific, but in particular, they built ports in Vanuatu. And of course, they want to park their Chinese warships in Vanuatu's ports. That puts them within striking range of Australia. When we banned Huawei from our broadband network way back in 2009, then from 5G 2 years ago, and that is, by the way, supported by Labor and the Liberal Party, as much of China policy in Australia is. What did the Chinese do? Well, they went and offered to build a backbone fibre haul to PNG that would link to Sydney, and thereby accessing our broadband infrastructure. So you can't look at these things and just dismiss them as white elephants, which a lot of people assume they are. I think Jonathan's point is right. There's intent to all of it.
Right.
But do we necessarily incur like militaristic consequences in virtue of taking action against this? And as John has said, they will look to flex those muscles, presumably, in order to defend their interests. Is that inevitable? Is, I guess, what I'm trying to ask.
Well, nothing is inevitable, but also, I mean, two things. One, as I said before, look where we are now. Look where we are right now. We are in a terrible, terrible year with terrible, terrible consequences for everybody. That is the cost of doing business with China. And the other thing I would add is that we might sit here in our elite bubbles and talk and theologize about this. People get it. So attitudes in Australia have declined towards China demonstrably. In 2007, when I started political journalism, the Labor incoming Prime Minister, it was a change of government from a 4-term Conservative government. Kevin Rudd was his name. He spoke Mandarin. And this was hailed as a great thing because he was a future young, new dynamic leader who would speak Mandarin to the future. And that was how China was perceived, even in Australia, as only as recently as 2007. Now, last year, the Lowe Institute, which is a foreign policy think tank in Australia, it surveys sentiments towards major countries every year. They were at its lowest last year toward China. And that comes after a string of foreign interference scandals. It comes after interference on campuses, lots and lots of practical interference that people were seeing for real life played out in Australia, not just somewhere else. And so if politicians don't start addressing this, and this is the worry for Britain, if the politics don't get it, the people will lead them there. And the way that the people will lead them there is going to be a hell of a lot uglier.
Well, we've seen a little bit of that already with the 5G conspiracy theories, with the masts being burned and whatnot. I wanted to ask the panel if you know what wolf warrior diplomacy is. It's a term I've seen bandied around recently. I've heard there's an excellent movie called Wolf Warrior that sort of harkens back to the slightly more macho, jingoistic movies coming out of the US, like Rambo. Does it signal a kind of a diplomatic shift in the way China is looking to become more aggressive now?
Let me tell you a little bit about Wolf Warrior, because I've been using that in presentations and briefings for a couple of years. And Wolf Warrior is a movie. Has anybody seen it?
No, I've seen clips. I've seen, a little bit.
Right. So it's a movie that basically, it was China's submission to the Academy Awards in the year it came out, which I believe was 2017. And it, is the largest grossing movie in any single market other than Titanic and Avatar. And yet, most of us have never seen it outside of China.
Yeah.
And the tagline is it's what is it? 犯我中华者，虽然必诛, which means those who offend our China must be executed, even if they are found. Yes, isn't that lovely? And it basically has this a Chinese special forces detail doing special operations in an African country, and at the end there's a massive display of PLAN hardware just bombarding the coast. And at the end is a Chinese passport that says, essentially, citizens of China, fear not. If you are abroad, you have a strong motherland to protect you. And that's sort of the ending. So, so Wolf Warrior diplomacy, of course, is this idea that, today China's ambassadors have all taken up Twitter and started to spread conspiracy theories to sort of attack individuals. I personally got attacked by the China Daily's editor in Europe recently. So it's a lot of fun, I guess, a sporting thing. It's serious. I mean, they're spreading conspiracy theories. They're taking an aggressive approach on platforms that are obviously banned in China themselves. And this must be sanctioned in the sense of permitted by the foreign ministry. And the foreign ministry spokesman herself is just as colorful, and they have been for quite a while if one's been paying attention. But regarding some of this stuff, I mean, when Wolf Warrior came out, the lead actor said he never knew, but he lit a fire with such an outpouring of love for the motherland that he never knew that that's what he would do. So again, there's this very popular side to this whole idea of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. Even though this is led by the party, nationalism in China is really two sides of the same coin. I mean, we used to hear from people in the 2000s, scholars and experts saying the Communist Party is a restraining factor on the more dangerous elements of Chinese nationalism. So we want to work with the party because they'll hold back this other stuff that's, for instance, torching Ronald McDonald during the E2 crisis or something. So again, this is not new, but it's starting to find a voice that has gone international. And the other thing I would add to that is people talk about wolf warrior diplomacy. When Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai set up the original Chinese foreign ministry, they thought of it as People's Liberation Army officers in plain clothes. So the idea was that China's diplomats would go out and do essentially the work of, it's all been a unified system. It's a Leninist system where whether it's your diplomats or your army, you're pressing on the same objectives. And in this case, that's been the concept from the beginning. So we don't really want to look at these as sort of separate, interestingly related pieces. It's part of a grand operation in the service of a very clear vision of the future. And that's what we all have to understand.
Yeah.
So, sorry.
Well, I just have three quick examples of the way that this so-called Chinese diplomacy works. And one is the raw kind of money commercial side of it. And there was the highest profile example recently was the NBA case where there was a team manager who posted on Twitter something in support of the Hong Kong protesters, and the NBA's hugely valuable streaming deal in China was immediately suspended, and there was huge pressure on the NBA to fire the guy. They haven't, but they've appointed a new person to lead within China, who I think is seen to be close to have better contacts with the Chinese Communist Party. So there's commercial pressure that companies are going to come under, and that our governments need to work out how to respond to, and what we're going to say to companies when they, when they're pressured to do these things and they go to the government and say, we're going to lose, $1 billion or whatever. What is our government's response? Or are we going to pass laws that require them to not censor themselves, or whatever it is? We need an approach for that. And then another one, which is a far smaller, almost ridiculous one. So there was a cake decorating competition in Birmingham. It's the biggest cake decorating competition in the world. And one of the entries was, again, this was during the Hong Kong protests, and it was a cake of the protests, and it had like a little smoke machine, and it had, some of the symbols of the protesters and kind of masks that they were covering their faces, etc. And but suddenly the organizers are confronted with a complaint of some Chinese entrants saying, we find this cake deeply offensive to our culture and we demand that it's withdrawn. And the organizers were in a flurry. They didn't know what to do. They'd offended some people, or maybe it was somehow racist, and the cake was withdrawn, was told it couldn't compete in the competition. That is the level of pettiness and kind of detail and just maniacal desire for control that we are dealing with, and that we are totally ill-equipped to deal with, because the people organizing this cake competition, how can they be expected to know that there's actually an organized program to export censorship around the world on issues that China wants to control the narrative on? And we're just not we're not helping. Our government is not doing what it needs to do, and frankly the media isn't yet doing what it needs to do on that either.
In response to wolf warriors in Australia, the group of MPs who are the most strident on China, so I guess you'd call them the hawks, they've dubbed themselves the Wolverines, and on some of the MPs' offices, on their name badges outside their offices, they've got like Wolverine claws, and they've made up badges and stickers and tags and things. It's all a bit silly, really, but it does go to the point that this is being noticed and responded. And as for the wolf warrior diplomacy since COVID-19, I think that is honestly the West's best friend, because in Australia that has gone down very, very badly. The ambassador Chinese ambassador in Australia came out and gave an interview where he all but threatened trade retaliation against Australia if it continued to push for an inquiry into the origins of COVID-19. And I don't think Australians run around very much thinking about democracy and freedom and liberalism and all those things we like to talk about, but they absolutely do understand the sense of fair play. And so these things run very deep in national psyches. And I think the more the Chinese go on with this aggressive posturing, the better it actually enables politicians to go to their people and say, look, the economic times ahead are going to be painful, they're going to be tough, but we're going to be more resilient as a result of it. And here's why we need to do it.
So what does this mean for countries? Well, I suppose Hong Kong's not a country, but Hong Kong and Taiwan, given their proximity to China and how much they feel the brunt of all these effects, how do you think Western relations with Hong Kong and Taiwan will change? How do you think we can support them better going forward over the next couple of years?
I think there's a rethink on Taiwan coming, and the WHO and WHA, are going to accelerate that. I mean, at this point, Taiwan is obviously eager to come into the sort of, Pacific security picture. I mean, things like their southbound strategy are meant to reach out to other democracies from Australia to India, certainly to the United States. And the more that a consensus builds around the fact that the People's Republic of China and the Communist Party of China are genuinely hostile to the United States and to the broader world. In many ways, this is China's war with the world. The world stands in the way of their great rejuvenation, and that's really the essence of the nationalistic views behind it. Taiwan represents an important example of a place that they lost the Civil War. The Kuomintang lost the Civil War, went across the strait and built ultimately a thriving democracy that's very friendly to the Pacific democracies. So I think we're all going to be looking at that more carefully. And then as to Hong Kong, sadly that is the place that the world can see under the boot of the Communist Party. They've essentially gone in there and started to crush it. And there's probably not sure what is left to be done, but I do recognize that Britain sees that as I think that's helping Britain understand what's going on here, particularly because of the Sino-British declaration was obviously torn up, as would most, China's view of what they call the unequal treaties, i.e. anything that was negotiated when China was not yet in the position of power that it seeks, being invalid. These are all the problems we have. So I hope we'll all pay attention to those places and also not forget about Xinjiang and Tibet. These are the places that tell us why this matters. At the end of the day, we're talking about the pursuit of power by a superpower that does such, those things in its own borders. The Communist Party of China killed 50 million people in the 20th century, and they were not nearly as powerful as they seek to be, nor were they global.
Well, on that note, I think we are coming to the end of our panel. I would like to say thank you to our fantastic panelists for joining me. We'll be going live next week at Tuesday at 6 o'clock as well. And I think I shall call it a day. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you.